We have a really terrific group of people, both on the panel and in the audience. So it's a real pleasure to have you all here today for what I think is going to be an engaging and important conversation. We convened this event with the headline question, do we need a new approach to support fragile states? I think, spoiler alert, I think you're going to hear a lot of yes to that. So probably the more important question is how do we need to change than whether we need to change. And we really have a pretty remarkable group of 5 people who can answer that question for us today. I will introduce them in a minute. I want to start by saying my name is Alex Thier. I'm the executive director here. In 2015, the world came together and committed to a series of goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, following up from the Millennium Development Goals. And these goals committed to some pretty remarkable things. I think first and foremost, they committed to the end of extreme poverty around the world after the incredible progress that we had seen in the intervening years since the Millennium Development Goals were established. And then, of course, with the Paris Conference and other things, committed to saving the planet and peace and security, and many of the things that we all know are critical to everybody being able to enjoy a life of basic human dignity. What we also have learned, and we probably knew at the time, but has become ever more apparent, is that our ability to accomplish any of these goals is largely going to depend on our ability to succeed in fragile states. There's an estimate that I've seen between 60% and 2/3 of all of the extreme poor will be concentrated in fragile states by 2030. And many of the other concerns that we have, whether it's about access to health and education, pandemic outbreaks, violent extremism, the plight of the displaced both internally and externally. Many of these issues center on our ability to do something meaningful and to improve the lot of so many people who find themselves living today in fragile states. Now, at the same time, there is a lot of thinking and talking going on. This year, the World Bank and the IMF put a pivot to fragile states at the top of the agenda during their annual meetings. There is a new commission report out from LSE and Oxford, chaired by David Cameron, that is looking at how to improve on fragile states. ODI has been doing a lot of work on this, and one of the reasons that you are all here today, the IMF Independent Evaluation Office has come out with a very interesting report on what the IMF can and should be doing. So it is clearly a moment of a lot of people paying attention to what is a critical issue. At the same time, many of the things that you will find in this colorful array of reports that you can find outside as well, is that these are not new problems. We've known about many of these problems for years. And so the question is, what is different now? What are we going to do now with the resources, with the institutions, with the actors that is actually going to be able to make a difference? With us today, we're honored to be joined by first Charles Collins, the director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the IMF, David Carew, who's joining us from Sierra Leone. He's the former Minister of Finance there. Rachel Glenister, the relatively new chief economist at DFID. We're very excited to have here. Catherine Nawajiaku. Close, I'm trying to pronounce that, not so good, who is joining us from Paris, where she is responsible for the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building Secretariat there. And finally, our very own Marcus Manuel, a senior research associate here at ODI, who's been focusing on these issues for many years. I also want to welcome again everybody in the audience. We also have quite a number of people, I understand, watching online. So if you see me, I am not looking at my iPhone during this. This is how we're getting questions from those of you who are participating either here or around the world. We want to encourage you to silence your iPhones or whatever device you have, but to actively participate in the conversation. You can do that in a couple of ways. You can tweet, and I think the hashtag is up there, hashtag Fragile States. We are at ODI Dev, and if you are online, you can click and actually send a question, and I'll try to pick some of those up as we go during the conversation. So without further ado, I would actually like to turn to Catherine first. She has been at the center of the community that has been focusing on the New Deal for Fragile States, which emerged out of the 2011 Busan Conference on Development Effectiveness. This has been a critical agreement and a community that has kept alive and tried to deepen many of the principles that were embedded in that document, and is overseeing how it's going. And so Catherine, as with all of our panelists, is going to have initially 5 minutes to share with us some of her reflections on how the New Deal has been going and where we should be going from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm very delighted to be here, and I thank you all for your presence here. So let me say a few words then. I won't go into too much detail about the New Deal itself, because I'm sure I hope it's well known by now, but when I look at this title, do we need a new approach to support fragile states, I have some doubts about the extent to which it's really known that well. Because what I'm finding increasingly in the array of reports that Alex just cited, as well as the independent evaluation, is that much of what the New Deal has been advocating for the last almost 10 years, okay, it was endorsed in Busan in 2011, but the group that came together in 2008 to draft an action plan, which then became the New Deal, is some 10 years old. So the fact that we're here and we're asking this question would suggest that there's still a lot to be done. So what was the New Deal trying to do? The New Deal essentially, it came at that aid effectiveness moment and was an attempt by countries affected by conflict and fragility to say, we want some of that too here, thank you very much. And so it was a kind of a deal struck between donors, civil society as well, but the governments of some 20, what emerged eventually as 20 countries affected by conflict and fragility, to craft an agreement about what amounted to better practice in those countries. And much of the effectiveness agenda essentially around using country systems, country ownership and leadership, capacity building to enable that, but prioritizing along the lines of government's own priorities, with peace building and state building at the forefront, was essentially what it was about. So what have we learned? What has happened in those 10 years, where we in the dialogue, the international dialogue, are also in deep reflection mode right now as to what all this has achieved. We do see many other initiatives seeming to take on board much of the agenda on the horizon, and so we are asking ourselves, so what is there left to do? Well, in 2015 and 2016, we did two deep dives, deep thinks into what has actually happened. One was the New Deal Monitoring Report, and another was an independent review of the New Deal and international dialogue, which New York University was commissioned to undertake. And essentially, their conclusions were that, there has been some quite dramatic progress in some places. So Somalia is often cited as one country in which the New Deal was very much critical in informing the way donors and governments came together with a whole architecture, very much taking the New Deal to heart. In other countries, in Sierra Leone, that we'll discuss later, in Liberia, in Timor-Leste, and in a number of other countries that weren't part of an initial 8-country pilot, there has clearly been an uptake in terms of some of the language of the New Deal, some of the ideals of mutual accountability, the development of a compact, and so on. However, the reports also concluded that much of the progress was bitty, much of the knowledge about the New Deal was very much located within particular parts of ministries of finance. there was a lot of difficulty in maintaining a political momentum around the agenda to which so many had committed. In 2016, I think we're talking about 55 countries and organizations. So we've had a kind of epileptic, erratic uptake of the New Deal. We've also had lots of conversations in the international dialogue about, what do we mean when we say countries have taken up the New Deal or not? And maybe the New Deal has shaped ideas about practice, which it's quite difficult to document because it's not a package. There's been a lot of debate about whether the New Deal has shaped practice in terms of everything in it, because it's quite detailed and quite complex, or bits of it have been influential. There's a lot of discussion about how if Afghanistan, for example, which didn't have a New Deal explicit framework, but was the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework, very much shaped by much of what is in the New Deal. So we have a mixed bag. Having said that, and I'll come to my 5 minutes, I think I'm going on a bit. Having said that, I'll leave you with a few thoughts, because there is a debate in the dialogue amongst the donor part of the dialogue, essentially about what we take and what we leave from the New Deal. Do we need a New Deal 2.0? This discussion is quite resisted by the G7 plus countries, who feel there is so much unfinished business that it would be too simple to say that, to draw a line and move on. And what's clear is that, certainly as I began my presentation in saying, there has certainly been an uptake of a lot of the New Deal language, and even in the SDG framework that you began with. SDG 16 is clearly, much of it is reflecting the peace building and state building goals, which is one pillar of the New Deal. And then right throughout the SDG framework, we have a concern to make building sustainable peace a cross-cutting objective. So we seem to be on the same page. However, it's a question of the how that continues to be very divisive. And I'll just leave you with one last thought that's very close to the hearts of G7 plus countries, and this whole issue around what we mean by use of country systems, to what extent it's still on the agenda. What we have learnt in the dialogue is that although when we say use of country systems, for many it means budget support, that is very difficult. In some countries, particularly in Somalia, for example, there has, thanks to the New Deal, been a really interesting country-level discussion between governments and donors about the detail, about how we have to be nuanced about what we mean when we talk about use of country systems. So rather than presuming that all G7 plus countries are intrinsically wedded to budget support, it might be a long-term goal, but in Somalia, the conversation is about to what extent the government, given its institutional weaknesses, can have effective oversight, for example, over the use of third parties. And that in itself as an important milestone towards what would look like country systems. So I'll kind of leave it there. I'll probably come back to some of these issues afterwards. But I think I'll stop. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Catherine. Charles Collins was appointed the director of the Independent Evaluation Office by the Executive Board of the IMF in 2016. You've previously worked for the U.S. State Department, the Treasury, and the IMF, so a great view across some critical institutions. And you've now put out, I think, a very incisive critique or assessment of the IMF and what it could be doing better. Share.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to ODI for hosting this event. This is our report. You have copies outside. Just very quickly go through the main findings. I think overall the fund has actually made an important difference in many fragile states, particularly as they emerge from conflict. The IMF is good at emergency management. It comes in quickly, it provides support, it helps to stabilize macroeconomies, it helps to rebuild core macroeconomic institutions like central banks, like currencies. like revenue systems that have fallen apart during periods of conflict, with its capacity development work. And it helps to catalyze flows of external support. If the IMF gives its stamp of approval, donors pay attention and provide substantial amounts of funding. So the fund has played a significant role, as as we went through our case studies, was widely recognized. On the other hand, we think that the fund has fallen short of its aspirations. I think there is a recognition that helping fragile states is a priority global public good. The fund has signed on to that. But in practice, when we look at the fund's sustained work in fragile states, we think it falls short of that aspiration. That the fund is conflicted. It believes in the aspiration, but on the other hand, it's also reluctant to move away from its standard business model of dealing with countries, which doesn't necessarily fit very well to fragile states, countries that have weak institutional capacity, where there are governance issues that are subject to frequent shocks, political shocks, security shocks, commodity price shocks, disease shocks. These are countries that find it very hard to sustain high-level policies that typically the fund will ask for in order to provide sustained financial support or capacity development support. So there's a problem. When we say the fund's business model isn't well suited, we go through a whole series of issues. One set of issues surrounds fund financial facilities. The fund does not have a special dedicated facilities targeted at fragile states. Rather, fragile states have to fit within the typical package of fund facilities. We think there's a gap between the low conditionality, rapid financing, but small amounts that fragile states can quite easily access, and the larger amounts of sustained access require high-level policy delivery, and that fragile states find it difficult to do. Second, we find a problem on capacity development. The fund has ramped up its work in providing capacity support for these countries. It's moved towards changing its business model to provide more on-the-ground support, but not enough. For these countries, it's not sufficient to just deliver a nice blueprint. You actually have to be there, have an office next to the ministry to actually help them as they work through their problems. But this is expensive. It's not necessarily efficient. It's not necessarily value for money unless you take a long-term view of how capacity development delivers. Third problem, it's hard to attract the best IMF staff to work in fragile states. IMF staff come to work at the fund because they're interested in solving the problems of India or China or Japan. They're not necessarily coming because they have a deep belief in contributing to development. So the fund is different from the World Bank or from, say, DFID, where the staff is naturally interested in supporting fragile states. The fund needs to provide better incentives to recognize the work that's done on fragile states that it does. The fund is also very risk-averse in terms of sending people to fragile states. This is a point that ODI has raised on a number of occasions. There was a tragic loss of the resident representative in Afghanistan a few years ago, and since then the fund has been extremely cautious. So it works with countries in high-risk locations, essentially off-site, which is a reasonable response to high-risk situations. But I think the fund needs to be more flexible in looking for opportunities to re-engage with countries like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Somalia, where there are large risks on the ground. So there's a whole range of ways in which the fund's business model is not particularly well suited. In our report, we come up with a range of recommendations to adjust the toolkit of lending facilities, recommendations to strengthen on-the-ground support for capacity development, recommendations to strengthen the incentives for staff. But I think the most important recommendation relate to the need to provide high-level commitment at fund management and board to working on these countries. Because, as you said right at the start, Alex, these problems have been known for a while. But to change things, you actually need to bring in that consistent high-level support for actually doing things in a way that's suited for the needs of these countries. And I think that's what's been lacking up to now, and that's what we hope to get. There is going to be follow-up to the report. The fund management and staff are committed to producing an action plan to respond to the recommendations of the report that were endorsed by the executive board. The board discussed the report in March. They broadly endorsed all our recommendations. So we're looking forward to see the action plan, which is due by September.
Great. Well, we will all look forward to that. David, you have had the unique position of being a finance minister in a so-called fragile state at a critical time period for your country, and having experienced all of the institutions right around the table, plus another large group in addition to that. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and what you would ask, not only of your own government, but of the international community, and how you can do better, and not only in Sierra Leone, but more broadly?
Right. Okay. So this session here is a natural next step to what the report recommended, and in terms of collaboration, we see collaboration and coordination as a feedback to the donor community to unlock funds for the development of the country. But for a fragile state, it's not about donor funds. It's about creating the assurance for the business community to come in and invest so that the people would grow together with the company. So I will not focus on what the donors would do. I'll focus on how they can help the country move to the next stage in its development. Because for me, that is what I would like to see when a country moves out of fragility. We do not want to stay in fragility forever. We need to be able to grow our own natural systems. We need to make sure that we take care of our people. So in doing that, I would like to see more collaboration between the IMF, the donor community, the CSOs in the countries, and the private sector. The private sector should not be left behind. I know that the donors, they have their own programs, they have their own budgets which they have come with, and they have their own favorite topics or sectors that they would like to put their monies in. But there must be a way where we would all sit around the table and align our aspirations, our growth agenda with everybody that's interested to sit around the table with us. That is what I'm looking for. Now, also, we need to see how the community, the donor community, can help us not only in the social sector, the health and the education, but then there's a bigger need in infrastructure. We firmly believe that infrastructure develops a country quickly because it supports industrialization, and industrialization would support employment, etc. And there would be more people moving out of poverty so that you do not come in and spend on our people on education and health. Perhaps we would be in a position to do that for ourselves, or we can get the people to do that for themselves. Now, so infrastructure is key, but this present situation now is that we do not get concessional loans, concessional funding for infrastructure development. We deal with commercial loans, and we are not able to handle the interest payment, and the negotiation skills that would go with that kind of transaction. So what happens? There's a ready partner. We turn to China. China is quite willing to come in and say, we'll give you infrastructure if you give us whatever, resources, land, etc. That arrangement is not so bad. But if we are not in a position to engage them around the table and measure our resources with what they are giving us or the value of what they want from us, we would always be at the losing side. So we go to the next stage, which I would hope is capacity development. We need to build the capacity of our nationals, of the people, the politicians especially, who have been given the mandate to sit around and enter this negotiation and see how they can get a fair deal from our people. It is not fair if a businessman has come up with a deal and he believes that he's done a good job, and when there's a change in regime, we go back to the table to say, sorry, we don't want this kind of thing, it's not good for our people, etc. The business community wants some predictability, wants some stability in their business relationship. If they do not have that, if we cannot provide that, it reduces the quality of people who want to come in. So I see the IMF, through collaboration, through coordination, extending its role, extending its capacity development agenda to help the country move forward. Now, in engaging with the donor community, I've added a few words to my vocabulary. One of them is regime change. That is fine, because at times in the country we all want regime change. At times we are fed up with the current government. They have outlived their usefulness. After the third year, they start getting into funny things. We want them, but I would hope that the donor community would not be so vocal. When you become vocal with that kind of agenda, you are conflicted and you lose your credibility. And towards the end of an era, you start getting into fights with the government. You really do not want that. And lastly, yes, okay, I know I'm running out of time. I know that the other thing I've learned is the low-hanging fruits or quick wins. These are normal donor speak. And they would come in, they want to prove that they're effective. They would identify the easy targets and do it in parallel with the national institutions we have, just to prove their point. And when they compete with our national institutions, it undermines the capacity development that we expect from them. And because of time, I think I will just put it there. If I have another opportunity during the discourse, we can have more exchanges on that.
You will definitely have that opportunity. Thank you, David. Rachel Glenister was appointed chief economist in January. You started, so getting into a government role after many other roles. You were the director of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, looking around the world at what works in development, and you were also the lead academic for the International Growth Center for Sierra Leone, so some real in-depth country experience as well. You've been working on these issues for a while from a lot of different perspectives. Are we getting it right?
Great, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this important question. I think I want to just echo the point that, to start with, that macro stability is really important for these fragile countries, and that, the IMF can and has played an important role in providing a framework for, bringing the donors together and for the government to kind of figure out what it should be doing to get the country back on track to solve its macro crisis. But I think this, as we've been saying, there's still a lot. We've been making these points, and at DFID we've been worried for a long time about the fact that we're not making as much progress as we would like, and as DFID we've made a commitment to spend a large proportion of our own money in fragile states, and we've been pushing other international agencies to focus on these countries, because this is where poverty is going to be. They are the threat to the international community. And if, the fund is serious about being the organization that worries about macro crisis, it needs to be very serious about working in fragile states. And I think the concerns that this report raises have, really resonate with us. I think, in a sense, a lot of them boil down to this question of commitment and, whether the fund sees it as a priority for itself. And let me just focus on kind of conditionality as one example. If you're going to do conditionality right, you need to understand the local context very well. In particular, in a fragile state, you can't just, take your conditions from any other place. You've got to understand, because as we've heard, there's a lot of, limits to capacity. So you've got to think about what are the key things that needs to change in this country to get stability, and what are the things that you can change? What's politically feasible to change, right? So when I've worked and given advice in countries, in my JPAL role and other roles, the key thing in my mind is not just where's the economics mucked up, where's their market failures, because those are everywhere, right? You've got to think about where is there a key constraint, and there's actually political ability to move on that constraint. And in order to understand that, you've got to be there. So that's part of what this report talks about is, the fund has to be there and commit people who are going to be there long enough to really understand the issues on the ground, in particular to see what you're looking for in a condition is something that the government can move on, is willing to move on, and is important for getting things back on track. So that's sort of the key issue. And what you don't want is a very long list of things which are really hard to do or aren't necessarily really important or, could overturn the government, right? Coming up with that right list really involves really understanding what's going on in this country. And I think that brings us to some of the other points in the report, which are about, human resources, having the right people to work on these countries. And I really don't think this is that difficult to solve. The challenge is, if you really wanted to have people who cared about understanding the political economy of these countries, there are people out there. The fund just isn't hiring them. I've come from, most recently from MIT and worked a lot with Harvard grad students. There are very top economics PhDs in top universities spending their time on the ground in DRC in fragile states. Those people are out there. When I went to the fund and said this, they were like, oh, send them to us. I'm like, they're there, you're just not hiring them. You're hiring the people who've written a macro paper. But that's not, you're hiring people who've written a macro paper on Japan or the US. So you're not hiring these people. They're there. You could potentially think about recruiting them. Then in terms of incentives, there was a lot of discussion, really interesting discussion in this report about, are these people getting promoted? It's having worked in the fund, it's not that difficult to change the incentives in the system. If the managing director chairs the board meeting of a country, it sends a signal, this is my most important country. They chair the US board meeting. Well, the IMF is, to be honest, not going to have any impact on what the US does. Now, what I always thought when I was inside the IMF was, the interesting, exciting place to be is where you can actually change things. Note that, that's where the IMF's resources are at stake. And that's what's, obviously the US is important for the world economy, but, is the IMF really going to change it? So I don't think it's that hard to change some of these incentives if people really wake up to understanding that these countries are critical to the economy and that the IMF has an important role to play. And I have to say, there were really, there are people within the fund who get this, who are really committed, but it's about, there's some bigger changes within the institution that have to take place. Can I just take a minute to mention a couple of the things that came out of Sierra Leone, because it is, close to my heart. And one is on infrastructure, where, I think there is a growing recognition, and certainly within DFID, about the importance of not just doing health and education, which are really important, but also things like infrastructure and working on economic growth issues and economic development issues. And that's, donors are increasingly getting into that space, and I think that's a good thing. On quick wins, I completely agree I do think it's possible to get quick wins that work with the government institutions. It's really important when, as donors coming in, that you're building the institutions of the country. But it's also important when you're trying to build political, support locally for the political solution, that you get quick wins on the ground too. And so the first work I did in Sierra Leone was some rapid results work with decentralization, where they were giving money, the World Bank was giving money to deliver quick wins through the newly set up government districts. So that's kind of quick wins and building government systems, and that's, the best that you can do in these kind of situations.
Thank you. Marcus, I don't know if it's true, but it's rumored that the Secretary General of the G7 Plus once called you the godfather of the New Deal, or maybe midwife. But, in 2011, I think that many of us watching Fragile States thought, wow, this is actually something, this is real, this is serious, there's some great principles in here. And looking back from 2018, it doesn't feel like we've made the progress that might have been promised through that. And so maybe move us towards action a little bit. Is the problem that we don't know what the problem is, or the problem is that we're not solving it?
Thank you. The Secretary General of the G7 Plus is a great diplomat. But the truth is there were hundreds of people, thousands of people, who put together the New Deal. It was the best from a whole set of institutions and countries who really thought about it. And then the Secretary General came himself and he said, this is what I want to do. He had torn the New Deal through 33 development agencies of the UN. He said to them, you're all going to have to sign this within 6 weeks. They all said that's not possible. And there was stories of blood on the carpet on UN boardrooms about how much he drove that. And I think in 2011 there was a sense, we've now got it. We understand what we've got to do, we're now going to do it. And I think the tragedy is that we haven't delivered on it. And I think that's the real mystery. Why didn't we do it? And when you have issues about people saying, we believe this is right, and you've heard Charles speak about, the IMF believes what's right, but you don't do it, you're either in the area of delusion, to be nice, or in the area of hypocrisy if you want to be really sharp and nasty. There is something very deeply wrong about what's not happening. Because some of it, as you say, is actually quite easy to do. I mean, it really isn't that difficult to hire people in the IMF who know about fragile states. But we're not doing it, and I think that's what I want to do. I think one of the problems looking back was the New Deal was incomplete. It didn't have enough about growth, and I think it's really good to see there's a lot about growth that's happening. And the Fragility Commission is absolutely spot on to say, we need to think more about that process. We need to bring in the development finance institutions. So I think that's good and that's great. It never had the IMF involved, so it's really nice if the IMF were to sign up, because I think if you want to have inclusive societies, how you share your resources in an efficient and effective way, what the IMF would call fiscal policy, is really, really important. So I think having them too. But I think the big problem, which is often the problem we talk about in aid, is the lack of ownership and the lack of political will. And I'm not talking here about the fragile states. I'm talking about the donors. The donors never really bought into the New Deal, to be frank. It got a bit forced upon them, and they were a bit rather startled and surprised by the process. And they never really said, yes, this is what we are going to do. There was a lot of rhetoric, and there was a lot of rhetoric around, we need to take more risks. But any objective assessment of what's happened in the last 7 years is that collectively donors have taken less risk. Now, there's a reason for that. That's not to say, it wasn't an irrational choice. It was to do with pressures around political pressures, domestic pressures at home. But the reality is that the UK took a lot of risks to help rebuild Sierra Leone and Rwanda and is not capable of taking those kind of risks again in countries. So unless we understand why things didn't happen, we will be condemned to repeat our mistakes. And that's why I'm both delighted by the Fragility Commission in coming out and saying, look, this is really important. Look, we need to prioritize inclusive politics over maybe health and education. Look, we need to use country systems. And Donald Kaberuka went on saying, yes, we need a new paradigm. Yeah, absolutely. But why haven't we got there before? So how might we actually change that? And I think there are two levels of change where we need to press. First of all, I think we need to change what we do in country. We need to get to a situation where every donor partner wakes up that morning in the country and says, how am I going to reduce the risk that this country falls back into conflict? And if I manage to do that by the end of the day, that is a success. And that's all I'm going to try and do. I'm not trying to do the 33 other things that my organization thinks is important I should be doing in every single country. I'm just going to try and do that. I'm going to try and work with my colleagues to do that. Now, if we did that, well, then we might have a chance. But I think we all recognize we're a long, long way from getting to that point, both in terms of a sense of collective ownership of what the issues are, about what the priorities and the alignment to actually deliver on it. So there is an enormous piece of work still to be done. And fragility assessments in the New Deal were an initial starter to do that. But we really got to get to a point where we are really serious about saying inclusive politics, reducing the risk of conflict. So we need to change what we do in country. Then I think there are two changes we need to do internationally, and one of which is funding. So South Sudan said, we need to rebuild the roads. South Sudan had no roads. We want to rebuild the roads. And everyone thought that's a really good idea. And so the idea was to build the roads from here to where Catherine is. It would have still left South Sudan with fewer roads than any other country in sub-Saharan Africa. This was not a mad road building program. This was a modest one. After 10 years, that is how many roads have been built in South Sudan. We just didn't have the mobile. Everyone said road building is actually rather expensive, so actually we'd rather go do something else. Thank you very much. We want to, build a few health centres or do this. We're not going to build the roads. So there's some really deep sense of failure to prioritise at the collective level. When a country comes out of conflict, you need massive resources to get the hydropower switched on again. You need to get the roads built or whatever. But that's why the infrastructure in Sierra Leone has taken so long. There weren't the resources to mobilise at that particular point. And then the second issue, I think, is the whole issue about how we hold ourselves accountable. How do you actually measure whether we're making progress in reducing conflict? How do you actually measure that? We're not even measuring it, so how can we even begin to hold ourselves accountable for whether we're doing that or not? So I think it's great that we've reunited on we need to do this. It's a priority. I welcome the high political statements, but I think unless we engage with the reality of why we've not delivered that collectively in the past, and why you find it difficult from small things to large things, I don't think we're going to make the progress we need to. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. So what I'm going to do now is go across with a little speed round. I'm going to ask you each a couple of questions, maybe in part inspired by what your other panelists said or what you said, and then we'll go out to the audience. Charles, let me start with you, because you are talking about a specific set of changes in a specific institution. You've got your own experience with the U.S. government. I worked for the U.S. government. You've got some DFID folks over here. Who's the problem? What's going to prevent the change from happening? Is it the IMF bureaucracy? Is it the shareholders? Which ones? I know you're not going to be reluctant to name names, but help us understand who is it that is actually going to drive the sorts of changes that you have so eloquently and precisely articulated in your report.
Again, I think it's a matter of prioritization. Is the international community really willing to say not only are fragile states important and a global priority, but we are prepared to change the way we do business in key institutions like the IMF in order to help fragile states? The problem is that the IMF has multiple objectives. And when it makes changes to, for example, its lending facilities, it says, okay, well, if we do this, maybe this is going to help these fragile states, but on the other hand, it may water down the incentives for other countries to follow the right policies. So maybe we don't want to go quite so much in that direction, rather we want to go in this direction. Similarly, on the HR issue, say, okay, we'll put more resources on these countries, but where are we going to take the resources away from? And the board is quite good at saying, yes, let's do more to help in this area, but it's much less good at saying where we should take the resources from. So it's a matter of delivering on these aspirations by making hard choices, and that's different. That's very difficult in an institution that works on consensus, because you'll have some champions who are pushing really hard for the fragile state work to get more attention, but at the same time, there are going to be other shareholders who are going to, in public, they'll be supportive, but in practice, they're going to be resistant to the sort of institutional changes that are really needed in order to achieve this.
How is this going to happen here? Is it a management of the institution that's going to pull along a reluctant board, or is it the board that's going to push along a reluctant institution? Where's the...
Typically, the way the fund works is you have a proactive management. Once management decides it wants to do something, then it works very hard to find ways to do it, but it has to bring the board with it, and it needs to be clever in building coalitions to support the sort of change that it wants to achieve. And that's difficult when you have a fairly diverse group of countries around the board. So there is voices on the board that are strongly supportive of doing more for fragile states, but that's still a minority. So management is going to have to work pretty hard to build a viable coalition to develop enough support around the table in order to achieve these difficult changes. I mean, Rachel says it's not so difficult. The reality is that underneath the deep ways in which the fund works are less easy. If you talk to the managing director and say, well, can you do this? Can you hire these 15 MIT experts in fragile states? He said, yeah, I'd love to do it, but I have to work through the system. So you can't work by fiat. So it takes time. But I think if there is a genuine commitment to making that change happen, then the fund is a sort of place where it can be done. But there needs to be that genuine level of commitment.
So Rachel, you've got a weighted set of votes in your pocket. You may have left them in the other room. Is this something is it too soon to say, or is this something that the UK government is going to be willing to push the IMF on?
We have been pushing very hard on this, actually. So, yeah, and the people who are responsible for, deciding where our votes go are nodding in the audience. So, yeah, this is it. I mean, it's been a priority for our own spend and our own people. So, DFID sends people to a bunch, has good economists in countries where the IMF will not go, for example. And it's a priority in terms of where we're putting our votes in the board and resources in the board. I mean, I think they're kind of getting a little bit sick of us saying, talking about, the IFC, for example, just had a big increase, and we've been important in pushing them to be spending a lot more of their money in fragile states, CDC the same way, and we're kind of working through the institutions, pushing fragile states in all of them, and the IMF is one of the ones where we have been pushing quite hard.
Let me ask you from the DFID perspective. One of the things that obviously comes with investment in fragile states, as several of the panelists have said, is higher risk. If you are going to invest more, push other institutions to invest more, we all hope that is going to have a big, positive, long-term critical outcome, but it's likely to have some glaring failures too. Yep. And we live in a climate here in the UK that has a challenging moment around these questions of accountability and risk and value for money. So how do you think about sort of building support for the types of investments that need to be made to accomplish the objectives everybody's talking about, given that that's also going to have a higher risk profile?
So, I mean, some of it is we've been quite explicit. So in the IFC or the CDC, it's quite explicit in when we give them money and saying, you get this money, but we want you to put more of it into fragile states. And we understand that comes with a certain amount of risk. So there's, they're allowed to make less return or have more failures in those fragile states. I mean, that's part of an explicit arrangement. I think, talking a lot about political risk, I think that that's not so much about working in these countries. That comes in working through the government system. So I'm a big, I'm very much in favour of trying to work through government systems, and that comes with political risk. So if you push money through a government, and some of it gets stolen, and it's DFID money, then that is a big political risk, because that does then threaten aid in general and 0.7. So it's not working in these countries. I think the difficult trade-off for DFID is working, when do you work through government systems? Because yes, it's the right thing to build those systems. Now, I think there's some interesting ways of doing it. For example, like the Sierra Leone case that I talked about, in terms of giving money through the districts. So, sometimes when there's a ban on giving money through the central government, you can work with district governments who are still part of government, but, and then you can choose the districts that are, that are the better districts. And you can also get some political competition going, which I think is really healthy, in terms of saying, we'll work with the best districts and the districts who, can prove that they've got the best value for money. So, I've just come back from Mozambique, where, another fragile state where there's been conflict recently, but very critical to the development of that country is going to be having some political competition in a country that, for 40 years has been under the same ruling party. But if they're moving to decentralization and the opposition is having will be in charge of some municipalities and some provinces, then you can start saying, well, let's get some competition going between the different parties as to who's going to manage this. And that might be lower risk for us to put some money through those states. So, we're looking for places where we can manage the political risk, or the reputational risk. I mean, that's the risk for us, is reputational risk. And yet, still build systems.
David, it's a really good segue back to you. We talk about local ownership and how critical local ownership is. And it is at the very time when it is hard to realize that local ownership because of capacity gaps. At the same time, Rachel talked about the C word, conditionality. And so I think at the center of these discussions often comes the question of who decides. Who is, when you talk about local ownership, who is local? Is it the national figures? Is it subnational? If the national figures are in power, but maybe not the greatest set of actors, how do we realize this ideal of local ownership with the realities of what it means to work in fragile environments?
The first thing to do is not to create a parallel institutions for these programs. Now, the state would have set up its own institutions. The thing to do is to work with these national institutions, build their capacity. They would feel more committed to it. They will feel a sense of ownership. But if that fails, there's also the local NGOs, the CSOs that we can use. But the people we have appointed to lead should believe in the process. They should see themselves as part of it, rather than these guys have come in to do something, we'll wait for them to finish, and then you go back to your capacity, and then there's zero capacity building, and we have not moved anywhere.
You said something very important earlier in your opening remarks about the donors and other actors all having each of their own agendas and favored sectors, and that's not to say they're bad things, whatever they are, but it is to say that it makes it incredibly hard to prioritize. You were in the position of having to try and get the donors to prioritize and follow what you believed was the right path. Any recommendations, because this is something that comes up in almost every single report or discussion around fragile states, what needs to happen in order to truly make it so that the international community is prioritizing around a local agenda?
We need the international community to respect that we have our own agenda. We, at times, understand what is good for our people. right? Don't forget that there's a big agenda for the politicians to get back into power at the end of their tenure. So they want to be doing some things right, because at the end of the day, the people would vote them in, but they do not have at times the capacity. They are not responsible for the fact that some of the people they appoint into political positions are not the right people, but they appeal to the public, so they have to deal with them. And when we have put these people in that position, we need to work together to see if we can build strong institutions around these people that would guide them in their service delivery. Right? So there must be continuous dialogue, continuous engagement with how we move forward.
Catherine, you said something very interesting at the start, which is your concern about whether the right people actually knew about the New Deal. And this is something that I've heard a number of times, because I think that there's a perception that the development community embraced the New Deal, thought about it, have met about it, but that the political and security communities maybe weren't so involved and didn't really back it fully. And obviously they bring an enormous amount of power to build or detract from that progress. So what would it look like to make sure that there's a much more kind of engaged and joined up approach, and why didn't the New Deal get that right?
I mean, I think there are a number of reasons for this, and one of which was, I think, initially at least, there was a perception that the New Deal had been sort of coloured as a donor agenda. Very much, it's the place of the International Dialogue Secretariat and the OECD, and the evolution out of something that was an OECD initiative, initially kind of hampered some of the wider buy-in that was, at least on paper, the priority. So the peace building and state building goals, which is one pillar of the New Deal, is about security, justice, inclusive politics, and so on, which suggests the importance of building bridges with a wider diplomatic community. And security community. I think there are new opportunities right now for that. I think the SDGs in particular create a new moment, and also the Sustaining Peace Agenda at the UN for starting to build bridges between what the New Deal described and some of the actors that there will need to be in. And also there are changes in the cast of characters that sit around the OECD table, for example. So you'll have many ministries that are not just development agencies, but also include foreign affairs, and that has started to create avenues for new bridges being built. It's not in all agencies, but it is happening, with the pros and cons. I wanted to say something as the others were speaking, particularly on risks, and I'll take this opportunity for also saying it. I think there's a question about the narratives, and it sounds a bit sort of qualitative in this space that is about hard facts, but narratives are really important in terms of changing mindsets. So why am I saying this? In Somalia again, the example that I used is really, it speaks volumes, because there you had a country which had been in a situation of extreme crisis and conflict for 20 years. And at one particular moment, donors and everybody else comes together around an agenda. And what's been fascinating about Somalia has also been this working group and country and dialogue around what use of country systems might look like. And they've done some very interesting work that was published, I think, earlier this year, supported by a World Bank UN kind of aid coordination unit, that looks really at this question of risk and really whether and the contradictions in the narrative around political risk, because when third parties, for example, are used to provide services and so on, perhaps there are issues in terms of lower thresholds of tolerance around risk that are accepted or acceptable. But when it comes to government, there seems to be a higher threshold that sort of governs the way people think about risk. So when resources are channeled through the government, the bars come up and the concerns about domestic audiences and so on. But when NGOs are used, for example, to provide services, much less stringent conditions in terms of how they might be. Sorry, I see. It's an issue that colleagues in the working group have raised.
It's a bit of a sensitive topic at the moment.
Okay, I'll shut up now. Sorry. Okay, but it is discussed. So I think with G7 Plus particularly are very keen to engage at a political level about risk management, risk tolerance that were very much kind of bread and butter issues for the New Deal at the outset. So I just thought I'd say that. And just one final issue around monitoring. Someone mentioned monitoring earlier and the fact that we don't know what making progress towards peace might look like, or, you know, the wonderful comment about, you know, wouldn't it be great if every the senior DFID person in country would wake up and think, okay, what am I doing to... It's a huge challenge because the short time I've been sitting in this very uncomfortable seat of managing the International Dialogue Secretariat, that's some 4 years now, you see goalposts shifting all the time when political commitment is difficult to sustain. So the way in which we monitor, and I'm speaking very freely here, I apologise to all this, you might be offended, but you know, when political commitment is very difficult to sustain, so the way we begin to look at it, what are we really referring to when we talk about implementing the New Deal? So slightly changes to make the notion of progress a bit more, you know, we can say rosier things about what we've actually achieved. And I think this is a source of intense frustration for many G7 plus countries that would like to see us getting back to the unfinished business that we initially set out. That's politically charged, very, very difficult, but as we're thinking about how we implement these recommendations or the recommendations of the Fragility Commission report, we really need to think about, can we agree on how we measure these things that we are deemed to treasure? And just a last tiny point about narrative. In terms of trying to push those who might be reluctant to do the very simple things that you suggested might need to be done in terms of human resources and so on, the scary narrative story could be quite useful, because you started off, Rachel, by saying this peace and fragility, the consistent fragility problem is a global problem. It's our problem. It's my problem living in Paris. It's our problem living in London. It's a global problem. So if it's difficult to get senior management to move on it, I think we could get a bit more creative in terms of presenting it as a global problem, not just the program of would-be development-minded types who would like to spend time in DRC and so on. Sorry.
Marcus, before we go out to the audience, just kind of a segue from something that Catherine said earlier about the New Deal and 2.0 and the need for sort of momentum. I mean, in many ways, 2011 seems like an eon ago, looking at just the last 2 years and the political tumult, the geopolitical changes that we've all been through. I was recently in a discussion in Washington. I won't say who said it because it was a closed-door thing, but a senior political figure in the U.S. establishment on the Republican side said, you know, don't come to us with something from 2011 not made here. It's not gonna happen, right? So, I mean, and that's not just a Washington problem. Everybody wants the new thing to kind of move forward and get political momentum. So, okay, so the New Deal was great, had some benefits, had some challenges, but what should we be doing now to kick off momentum with all of this energy that we've been talking about, from the Secretary General on down, to do something serious moving forward?
I think there's two things we need to do. I think, one, we, as a community, it's important we inform whatever is new by the lessons we've learned from the past. So I think until we're a bit more honest about what's gone wrong in the past, we're not really going to be able to form something that's useful, that's new. But But the second thing, of course, yes, from a political viewpoint, you need to renew things, and having a new deal that's 7 years old just doesn't make sense. I think there may be something around the issue of results, because I think one of the things we all are agreed on, we need to have a much stronger drive on results and on impact. So that's why I think something around the monitoring and being much smarter and going back to the basics, saying, okay, let's talk in country about what for you would make a difference in making you feel more secure. And let's ground it in what people want, not what governments want, but what people want. And then how are we going to measure that? And then put money, serious money behind in monitoring that in a fairly high frequency way. Put money behind in a fairly high frequency way about, is the money actually getting down to the people? If we give it to a district, is it actually making it to the school? And I think there is actually potentially an opportunity around that. And I think that might be a way of driving a lot of things, because it would go back to saying what's important for the country, which is then takes us back to the core of where we should be starting, but also straps on how do we actually put into results. And I think if we invested more money in that, that might be a way forward.
Great. So we're going to go out for some questions from the audience. And if those of you online want to submit questions, again, I encourage you to do so. I'll gather up 3 questions. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and where you're from, and if you have a specific question for a specific person, that's great. If not, we'll figure out who's best to answer it. So anyone out there? Gentleman in the back.